Okay, so we are in session 3, and we named the session as "How Should We Research Social Movements?" And we are actually recording the session, so maybe I should mention that as well for all our participants and audience. So I am Sutapa Chattopadhyay. I'm one of the editors, and I am located in Atlantic Canada. And I'm currently working in 2 programs, Women's and Gender Studies and Development Studies, and at St. Francis Xavier University. So I thank again Laurence for bringing all of us together. The research, I'll maybe very quickly, I engage with research on migrant incarceration and squatting movements, and on women's food producing initiatives in Belize. And the research that has gone into the book through the chapter and some of my engagements with social movement started off with my research on the resistance that was happening in the Narmada Valley in India, in the western part of India, the resistance was mainly because of a major hydropower project that was built, which had dislocated about 2.5 million people. And so there was resistance that happened for close to a decade or a little longer. And I got engaged with it as a student. Each of us actually have a question that we'll pose, and the hope is that we'll have some discussions around the questions. So the question that I had for us is, whose voices, stories, and experiences are centered in different research approaches? Or what do different stories tell us about their involvements with movements, or them as people in resistance movements? And it also kind of how I came forward with this question is because I do ethnography and I engage with narrative methods. And I see narrative method, or the lens that I bring to narrative method, is a decolonial lens and a feminist lens. And I collect stories to understand the different movements organizing and the resistance in which people get involved with. And I study from the stories that I collect. So that's how I came about with the questions. So maybe I'll stop at that, and I'll pass it on to whoever wants to take it, Laurence, Alberto, and Anya.
Well, maybe just before we answer this question, I should just step back slightly and apologize to people. We thought we were going to have a 5th person here, who is Keisha-Khan Perry, author of a very interesting book, Black Women Against the Land Grab, which is about racial justice in Brazil. One of the people who endorsed the book. She's not here. We haven't heard from her. So these are the questions that we were going to ask to a 5-person panel, including her. So just to throw that in. It leaves more time for discussion in some ways.
So should we go ahead and and start a discussion? So just very briefly, because it's about brilliant to introduce herself. So maybe I should say a few words about where I'm from and why I'm here. So my name is Szolucha. I currently work as an anthropologist at the Institute of Ethnology and Cultural Anthropology at the Jagiellonian University in Poland. And in the past, I did research within the Occupy movement and with other similar groups and movements, and then moved on to researching the social impacts of fracking, mainly in England and Poland. Right now, I am working on something a little bit different because I'm working on the social imaginaries of space exploration, of all things. You can ask me how I got to that in the Q&A, and I'll be happy to answer. And I can already see Sutapa, Alberto, and Laurence laughing, so it is a funny story. Right, so just to kind of maybe start answering Sutapa's question, and I think this is actually something that perhaps connects all of us here as the co-editors of this book, that when it comes to researching with social movements, the kinds of stories, the kinds of voices that we always center are the voices of the people who have a stake in this research and who many times they initiate that research or the need for that research comes from them. And why am I saying this? I think it's because we all have very participatory approaches to research. Of course, you know, a lot of the people who have contributed chapters to this book work, they have or they share similar sort of principles when it comes to researching within social movements as we do. And that was one of the reasons we really wanted to have this book, to kind of also bring to the fore the researchers and the movements that were learning and that were studying themselves and other issues in a more participatory way. So that was one idea behind that book, and we really tried hard to have both sort of more traditional approaches and perspectives. So you can also find like quantitative methods and chapters on that in the book. But we really wanted to kind of bring forward the more participatory, the more sort of action-oriented research approaches. So I guess, you know, when it comes to what sort of stories we want to center in our research, these are the stories of the people who, you know, who have identified a particular issue, a particular problem, or a particular question that they want to have answered. And we sort of work from that bottom-up perspective. And I'm sure that Laurence, Alberto, Sutapa, you will have a lot more to say on that.
Hello, everyone. Again, you've been suffering my English for most of the day, and you'll keep suffering it now. So I do my best to introduce myself. Okay, so I'm Alberto Arribas. I'm talking to you from Madrid. I'm Madrid right now. I'm currently working at the Applied Sociology Department in the Complutense University of Madrid. But I mean, before that, I've been working in universities in Ireland, in South Africa. I've done research in Peru, in Mexico, and most of the time, I'm also outside academia. So my position is a bit awkward. You know, I don't know whether I should call myself an academic. I don't know if I can call myself an activist anymore either. So yeah. I think most of us are always, you know, in between these worlds, you know, and from that strange position is where I write, where I teach whenever I'm invited to teach, where I try to live basically. And I've been involved in two main research projects. One of them, I work with grassroots social movement networks in Spain that work around precarity issues and migrant struggles. And something very interesting that happened in that research is that we tried to develop together collaborative ways of working. I mean, doing research with the movement itself, not on the movements, but with and for the movement. And that's been a constant in my career ever since. You know, it's hard for me to understand doing research on social movements. I mean, I do research with social movements. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But to me, movements are not an object of study or anything like that. They are subjects that think and act together, and I want to think and act with them. So that's like my point of departure. And the second project was similar in methodological terms, but very different, because I work with indigenous communities, Andean and Amazonian communities in Peru. So with working in very different understanding of what collective action is, what politics is, what the purpose and the medium of politics is. So it's very, very interesting, but also, again, trying to make research useful, relevant for the people that we're working with. So as Sutapa and all the other colleagues said before me, we have prepared some questions for Keisha. Is a pity that she cannot join us today. Okay, but so we are somehow sharing the questions with you, with all the audience, to see how they resonate with your own experience, with your own tensions, hopes, whatever. And my question is linked to what I said, what I just said, what I said before, is how come that social movement studies as a disciplinary subfield doesn't really care about relevance to movements of the knowledge and the research that we do? How is that? I mean, that concern about making that knowledge and that process of knowledge production useful for the people, the communities that we work with, is not common sense in the field. I mean, it's not that it doesn't exist. Of course, there are plenty of people doing that. The book is full of wonderful contributions of people trying to bridge academia and movements. And but I mean, in the last few weeks, I've attended several international symposiums on social challenges to contemporary social movement research. And this idea, this concern of relevance, is not something that comes up. It's how do we deal with online activism? How do we take into account big data in social movement research? But this preoccupation, this concern about making research useful, research that matters for movements, wasn't really there. So, well, that's basically it. Thanks so much. I hope we'll have time to discuss and share thoughts and fears and hopes and everything. Thanks.
So I should just say I've seen that Keisha-Khan has joined the chat. So
Hi, good morning. Sorry.
Hello.
I thought I had it at 10:30, but then
It's fantastic you're here.
there was also an email that said Thursday. So
that's probably my fault. I apologize.
No problem. So it was Thursday the 24th, and I was like, okay, well, I had it today, and then I was like, well, maybe they were tomorrow. So anyway, sorry about the confusion. I apologize.
No worries. Glad you're here.
Thank you.
So just to catch you up on what we've been doing, we've just had we were in the middle of a round of short introductions, and also each of us, the co-editors of the book, we've prepared a question for the roundtable and also for the general discussion with the audience. But now that you are here, we should probably give the floor to you if you'd like to say a few words, either about the book or about the theme of the symposium. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Sorry. I'm like the no video thing is hi, good morning to everyone. Again, my apologies, and I'm sorry for being tardy on the East Coast of the United States. I wasn't quite sure exactly how the discussion was going to go, so I'm just wondering if you could repose the questions so that I could hear them. I had prepared something brief about, thought I had 15 minutes brief about kind of my own work in dealing with these questions of research and social movements, but I also am okay with addressing the questions that you may have generally as it pertains to the book, of course, and the challenges of research and social movements, but also just to hear what everyone else has to say. So I'm okay with maybe having the questions be our starting point. We can also, I can also read from my notes. But.
Yeah, how about we start from, the 15 minutes from you about, about your own thoughts on the theme of the symposium in reference to your own work, and then we can go into the questions. How does that sound?
Okay, that sounds fine. So first of all, again, thank you so much for inviting me to participate. And I know I believe you had also invited me to participate in the book, and I could not participate effectively. So let me just organize my space here. So I've been working in Salvador, Bahia for probably the last 2 decades. So maybe since the early 2000s. Can you just one quick second, let me turn on some lights. Hold on. I haven't done one of these Zoom things in so long. So I've been doing research in Brazil, probably the late 1990s, early 2000s, in terms of collaborative research. And when I wrote my dissertation called that became my first book, Black Women Against the Land Grab, which was basically a complete shift from my original research project. So my original research was supposed to be about Black women's aesthetics in cultural movements in Brazil and Jamaica, comparative movement, after a year of working with women in Salvador who were focused primarily on land, housing, and water rights struggles in terms of for permanence, housing permanence in the center city of Salvador. I decided to shift my project. I wrote a dissertation that became the first book, Black Women Against the Land Grab, based on, in essence, what I felt Black women what was at the center of Black women's work in Brazil. So in essence, it became, my own research became driven by what the women were talking about. The dissertation itself, I felt, had a lot of personal reflections about what it meant to be located in these communities, doing this kind of work. I removed a lot of that information from the book and focused almost entirely just on the kinds of social actions that were taking place, that were driving the movement in Salvador around housing justice, right? Now I'm in the process of revisiting a lot of that material and new material to decide how to write a book, not necessarily a how-to book about how to do research in social movements, but the questions, but basically to grapple with some of the challenges, just like has been discussed in the edited volume, grapple with some of the real challenges and ethical dilemmas of doing research in social movements, but also social movements that have to confront state violence, right? So I think that book is what I'm currently working on, and that is, I think, really fits well into the theme of today's discussion about the fact that doing ethical, good, responsible, collaborative research poses a series of challenges that we should be thinking about. I can talk about this in the Q&A or in the discussion after, but I'm currently teaching a class called Archiving Urban Dispossession in Salvador, Bahia, Brazil. And part of the book is also focused on teaching, but I won't touch on that today. But partly the course involves a group of students trying to collaborate with community organizations in Salvador, ones that I've been collaborating with for years, to produce an online digital archive of their activism over the last 2 to 3 decades, right? And I can talk a little bit about what it means to do that kind of work and how challenging. And we'll do a special issue of NACLA Report in the Americas about the challenges of doing that kind of collaborative transnational work with students, involving activists as co-instructors in the course. So I can talk a little bit about the teaching aspect of it, but right now I'll just reflect on the the research component, and precisely what I would say the challenging work of what Vincent Harding and others have called what is the vocation of the Black scholar. So I'll start with a quote, and I already took up 5 minutes, so I'll try to be concise and probably cut through my own document here. I'll start with a quote from the Austin School Manifesto, and that manifesto was co-authored, was published by Edmund T. Gordon, but it's a collaborative essay written with me, Jemima Pierre, Jafari Allen, and numerous scholars who were doing their PhDs in anthropology at the University of Texas, Austin in the late 90s and early 2000s. So the Austin School Manifesto, an excerpt states, our aim is to form clearer conceptualizations of our collective condition, and more pointedly, to contribute to the liberation of African descendant peoples and all others from socially constructed limitations and diminished life chances. We believe that teaching and the production of insurgent knowledge is in itself one form of resistance. However, we struggle to push our work past discourse to praxis. We seek social transformation through both aspects of our work, unquote. So on this day in 2002, Adriele was outside playing soccer on the concrete walkway just in front of the three-room house located just underneath the street. She lived with her grandparents. No cars can drive there. A short stairway serves as an entrance. Every car, truck, and motorcycle passing above them leave a trace of noise. The rumbling motors, loud music, and greetings shouted to people walking on the other side of the barrier that separates them from the traffic. For few drivers notice the people disappearing under the street. The recycling carts provide a steady stream of movement, offloading the canvas bags full of money-making bottles, aluminum cans, and scrap metals. It's where the faces of the men, women, and children who pick through garbage cans or wait for bar patrons to finish their drinks are seen. Black, brown, sunburnt, scarred, muscular bodies. The bars in the city have generated more recyclables than the space under the stairs can hold until the truck comes the next day. This day, the concrete was clean, freshly swept by the old lady who only leaves her house to sweep, feed the stray cats, and the occasional doctor's visit, but the sweat of workers overpowers any smell of local food. The black beans and coconut milk, the fish stew and palm oil, beer. No broken glass was visible, making the concrete ready for child's play after eating fresh buttered bread and rich black coffee, sweetened without worry of the sugar disease that plagues her mother. She put away the black Barbies with little afro puffs resembling her own curls that the teacher brought to her from America. She loved that they looked like her. She kept them in a blue cloth bag in the bamboo closet where her grandmother stored all her cloth. They needed to rest anyway. Her grandfather had sewn together the ball from the clothing scraps that her grandmother gathered under her sewing machine, a work of art from a man who had never played the sport. This day, he didn't hear the sound of the workers or the cars humming above. He did hear the ball when it hit the metal door that separated their house from the street. Pel amor de Deus, for the love of God, I'm going to take the ball away from you if you hit the door one more time. They shifted the game to the left where the concrete curves downward toward the old house, but they stopped just before the water that had pooled in front. They didn't want to play there where newcomers had built houses in the arcs that had previously served as soccer fields and capoeira studios. She could always sweet talk her grandpa, but her grandmother's appearance would stop all the fun in a matter of seconds and awaken the neighbors who had just hoped to sleep in. Donna Irasi had produced fear. Her voice produced fear. Those hands and hips meant business. Her brother kicked the ball hard at her chest, not unexpected, but she was still surprised. She pretended not to cry in fear of this being her last invitation to play with the boys. But the ball was wet and heavy and it hurt. How many times had it rolled into the pool of water? She hadn't wanted it to touch her skin either. She was already wearing her favorite yellow bikini. Nowhere else in the city were young girls always dressed and ready to jump into the sea. More stairs took them to the bottom of the hill where the sea and fishing boats expected them to jump in any time of the day when the tides were low. No lifeguards were needed there, but she planned to go down to the beach with their grandmother when she went to talk with her friends as usual. This day, the weather was hot, unbearable. No fan was enough. She was certain that the sewing machine would stay still, being close to the water and with cold drinks was inevitable. That day, it didn't feel like she was waiting. Then a boy about her brother's age ran past them holding his pocket. She froze, wondering if she should set the ball or run too. Her brother called for the ball, but she hesitated. The metal door was about 6 steps away if she ran at full speed. Another boy ran past, and her eyes tried to follow him before he slid down the alley between the two houses. Whistling from the top of the steps, heeded a response in a language she couldn't recognize. Doors and windows slammed shut. She had a feeling again when her heart raced, and it would take a long time to slow down. She could hear her heart and her breath, but she could not move fast enough. Her grandmother's heart also beat fast sometimes, the doctor had told her. Hereditary. Would she faint before reaching the door? More movement, more steps above them, but this time not of flip-flop slamming the concrete, but of boots, heavy, fast, and angry. Run. The police invaded. I begin this work, in essence, with a confession, and I'm hoping that this story will drive my own story. I confess that every time I read my description of police raids, including the one I described from 20 years ago, my own heart beats really fast. I'm so focused on the words on the page that I forget to look at my audience, of course, and I guard closely any tears that reveal that I already know the ending to this story. In 2002, just as I started my doctoral research as an anthropologist in Brazil, Iracema Isabel da Silva Dona Iraci died of a heart attack at the age of 45 while defending her grandson during a routine police invasion of Gamboa de Baixo, a Black coastal community in the center city of the Brazilian city of northeastern city of Salvador. This is not unlike the stories activists tell of the joy and heartache of living in one of the most beautiful places along the Bay of All Saints in Bahia. Dona Iraci spoke in a high-pitched voice and laughed a lot, and she loved her family and her community. She gave her last heartbeat to the Gamboa struggle for land, life, and dignity. It was also Dona Iraci, one of the fiercest Black women warriors in the neighborhood association fighting against coastal evictions and for land rights, who told me that I could not understand urban redevelopment and forced displacement without thinking seriously about police abuse. In my first ever recorded ethnographic interview in 1999, she explained precisely how police violence and racial terror work in tandem with mass evictions, the central focus still. Almost 25 years later, I would sit, watch, and wait on Zoom in silence as a Gamboa de Baixo activist listened attentively to a police raid underway. The brutality of police violence and terror then and now impacts anthropological knowledge, methodology, and transnational collaborative ethics. You hold your breath and you wait to continue the discussion about the essay you are co-writing, the course you're co-teaching, or the graphic novel you are planning. I confess that when I've been in Gamboa de Baixo and other communities during these police raids, when the military and the SWAT police forces have descended upon the neighborhoods, I have to run at lightning speed into the bathroom of the homes of neighborhood activists and sit behind a concrete wall. It is difficult to describe in great detail what the terror of a police invasion sounds or look like, the state confinement of an entire neighborhood, the self-imprisonment of residents behind burglar bars, closed windows, and concrete walls, policemen and women threatening to kill, men and women being pushed onto the ground on the narrow streets inside their homes, women screaming to get their children out of the sea, divers and fishermen and fisherwomen desperately trying to paddle or swim to shore. It is as difficult to narrate the horror of rapid gunfire that alerted residents of the invasions in the first place. So I'll kind of just skim through my own work and say that part of what I'm trying to do in this work is to precisely not just grapple with the challenges of what we're experiencing, but certainly what you're experiencing simultaneously as what Denise Ferreira and others have called kind of a collective racial subjection, right? That you can't avoid, you can't not write about it, but you also can't avoid it yourself in terms of how you're experiencing the research, but also how you're living as a Black person in Black communities, right? So you're not, in essence, absolved from the same kind of collective racial violence of the people that you are researching. In the same vein, what it also means is that if you become part of the story and part of the violence, it also must mean that you're obligated politically and ethically to then to have your research, in essence, as transforming and confronting that violence be a key part of your work. So I think that, in essence, that yes, Black racial subjection and anti-Black violence have a direct bearing on the ethnographer's pragmatic ability to be an activist, carry out social science research, and produce hegemonic knowledge. But in essence, it still requires that be a goal of the work. So I look to the work of other Black women anthropologists, such as Catherine Dunham, Angela Gilliam, Kealeti Caldwell, Kristen Smith, who have done in Brazil precisely what Bell Hooks has described as an insurgent intellectual practice that emerges out of intimate and deep personal experience with researching, writing about, and fighting against anti-Black racial violence. So in reflecting on these police raids in my own writing, I've had to ask myself, why bother carrying out social science research amidst violence if I curl up on the floor and do absolutely nothing? And I talk about just more broadly, just how over the last 20 years, through various mechanisms, have tried to confront that in my own work. So I think I'm beyond the 15 minutes at this point, and we all know that in essence, the kinds of responsibility that it takes, the challenges, but also the responsibility of what it means to belong, to in essence be at home in these spaces, to do really engage research among social movement, also to not be naive about the implications. Another example that I draw upon, and I'll just stop there and as we reflect on this wonderful edited volume. And I think a lot about it in terms of even recent social movements and the kinds of strategies that people are utilizing, especially in the United States, around the current movements against the war. One of the things that has come up among activists in Brazil over the years, land and housing rights activists, is the strategic use of particular, I would say, a real critical approach to doing social movements and recognizing, not having a certain kind of naivete of trying to be kind of a hero of sorts. So I give you an example of me kind of being very active in terms of street actions in the beginning of doing my work, which changed over time with activists saying, well, if you get arrested by the police, that's of no use to us, and you'll also never be able to return to Brazil again. So this idea that you have to put yourself on the front lines at all times, I think activists themselves, and these are in most cases, Black women with up to, a kind of a middle school education, up to 8th grade education, who have said, we can put ourselves on the front lines. We are already occupying a certain kind of margins of Brazilian society, that we can put ourselves on the front lines. We can get arrested. But if you get arrested, it means that you will never be able to, there are all these other state interventions that you'll have to grapple with, that you'll be kind of useless to us over time. So this idea that one must always be engaged in a certain kind of action, I think is something that I'm grappling with in this book. Very different from the expectations then that have been defined in terms of my role as scribe, my role as, in essence, scholar, in terms of disseminating the work globally, the work of bringing activists to international conversations, whether it be at universities in North America, but also in international organizations like the United Nations. That particular role is a different kind of activism that is generally expected of the engaged scholar, who is oftentimes perceived as must be engaged in direct actions, burning tires on the street, et cetera. So I try to complicate that idea of the how to do engaged research may not always be the kind of exciting social action engaged research that one might expect. That sometimes there's a lot of it is a lot of meetings, waiting, the slow action, the quiet, invisible, undocumented action that becomes precisely what activists need. And just another quick example in terms of with working with students and bringing them to Brazil, and they say, well, what do you want from us? And they say, we just want you to spread the word. And the students are like, but what do you want from us? And like, we just want you to spread the word. So I think there are different expectations about what academia thinks is acceptable as kind of heroic social action versus what activists themselves understand our own limitations as activists doing research on social movements. So I'll end there, and I look forward to the questions, but also the questions about what I presented, but also the questions about the book and just generally doing research on social movement and complexities of that. And I really want to thank you again for your patience, but also for inviting me to participate in this conversation.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation and for your endorsement of the book. And it's wonderful because inadvertently, you've actually addressed Sutapa's question that we've been talking about before you joined. And she posed this question to all of us in which she asked what sort of stories, what sort of experiences we should put center stage when we're doing our research. And I think that you brought that out beautifully with the story that you told us at the very beginning of your presentation. But I must also say, like, if I may take a minute, that what you said later on about the sort of the type of different expectations of what it actually means to be an engaged scholar, that resonates a lot with my own experience. And I also talk about this in the book about my two completely different experiences in, working with two very different movements, with the Occupy movement and then with anti-fracking community groups, whereas the Occupy movement expected me to be engaged and to feed my learning and my study of the movement directly into movement practice. When I worked with community groups that opposed fracking locally, their expectation was entirely different. The expectation was you've got a PhD, we would like you to write articles and reports that we can present during the formal, semi-judicial inquiries, etc. And these reports, we are interested in you bringing forward the information about, the social impacts of fracking, because there was no information about that at the time. So I can definitely, so I recall there were instances when, I'll be observing a protest, or I'll be hanging out at near a fracking pad, and somebody would approach me and offer me an anti-fracking pin, for example, right? Or they would offer me to stay at their tent because they were camping out. They had these protest encampments, and then I'll look at them, and then it will take them 10 seconds to realize, no, right, you can't do this. And it's all right, and it's good, because you've got a different role. So there was this strategic distance that had to be kept, right? So it was not always about putting your body on the line, but contributing in other ways that were seen as more effective in a particular situation. So that's just from me. I'll pass it on to the others. I'm sure there are lots of different comments and questions. Yes, Sutapa.
I don't want to talk too much, so stop me if I do. I was actually, I loved the narratives that you were reading. And I was actually thinking about some of these questions that keeps coming back to me whenever I write about the Narmada Valley protests. And that is, who's producing knowledge? From where are you producing the knowledge from? Then how are we studying movements? Which positions are we researching movements from? Because I was asked this question, and I never have a good answer to that, is I'm from India. When I did my research on movements, I was studying in the United States, but I was studying movements in India. And I was asked this question as to why do we do development research on a global south from the global north? And so that was one of the questions that I was asked by somebody. And so it does talk about, but also like some of the other aspects that your narratives were touching base on were power relationships, like personal, like how personal can be political. Some of those things that I was kind of thinking of as you were talking. Yeah, I'll maybe stop here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not going to facilitate. So this is an exercise in self-organization.
I wasn't sure if I should respond or should I hear what other folks had to say. I wasn't.
Well, maybe let's gather a couple of observations or comments or questions, and then we can have a more general discussion. Anyone?
Okay, great.
Well, let me try to come in and complicate this a little bit, because so I really liked and agreed with, you know, what you said, Keisha-Khan, and what you said, Anya. Within a given kind of situation, where our situation is that we are academics who have jobs as researchers, we go and research somewhere and we try and do it in a certain way. And absolutely, that is useful, it's necessary. It's not how I personally came to it. It's not what I personally do. And I think this is interesting when we talk about centering voices, because the idea of centering voices suggests somehow that the thing that we are doing is bringing movement voices or the voices of oppressed people into some kind of privileged space, book publishing, academia, or whatever. And, you know, or the law. And these are definitely useful things to do. But what I want to bring out, given the very mixed audience we have here, including quite a few activists, is this isn't the only thing that movements do with research, because movements also research themselves. So this is where I've come from. And it's largely what I do, is I support activists researching their own movements. It's a really complicated thing. If you're doing that as an activist in your own movement, certainly there are questions of who you talk to, but the problem is not, do we center the voices of activists? The problem is, how do we say something to one another that is useful in that it helps us to do the thing we're doing more effectively in the teeth of repression, in the day-to-day battle against poverty and so on. So I suppose what I wanted to say there, it's really in answer to Sutapa's question about centering, is to say we need to be a little bit more aware sometimes of what we take for granted as our role, and to kind of think about, okay, there are actually these different kinds of activities going on. Being the heroic engaged researcher, being the slightly disengaged researcher who can produce useful legal knowledge, being the person who can tell a story on a global scale, but then also sometimes being the person who can facilitate a conversation within their own movement about where are we going and is it working.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think that, you know, again, this is all about a particular situation that we're finding ourselves in. And I think that perhaps something that, you know, Sutapa and I or others may have in common, and that comes forward in our approach as well, is that in a lot of these places that we do our research, we are the newcomers. Like, you know, wherever I did my research, I've sort of been a perpetual immigrant for all of my adult life, actually. So I guess that's probably coming from that perspective, you know, that I've never had a base for longer than 2, 3, or 4 years, right? So it's always been, which is also an interesting way of thinking about how you're negotiating your entry into a movement, and into a particular community as well. Because, you know, in a lot of ways, when we're doing this kind of research, right, and when you are doing it in an engaged way, and when you've got a personal history of activism, you're moving into a different country, and I'm talking about my own experience here, right? And of course, you're thinking about your job or your studies, but you're also looking at the different groups that seem in sync with your own, you know, principles, right? And then, you know, it may turn out that some of these groups seem like a good place for us to lend a hand by using our research skills, right? And that may be a sort of a bargaining kind of thing as well, as a sort of like a part of forming a relationship, you know, between you as a newcomer and a community, in a way, making yourself useful in a way. So I think, again, this all depends on your particular situation and your, you know, your positionality as well. But I think all of these kind of approaches are very important, and certainly, you know, being in a position to, you know, be in the movement and help from within that movement while you're, like, you know, embedded in it for quite some time. Like, this is definitely an experience that I'm looking forward to. Well, I haven't experienced it yet.
If I could just join in the conversation quickly, and I would say that obviously I'm coming out of teaching Africana studies. I'm coming out of the Black radical tradition, deeply informed by, you know, the Sylvia Winters, Fanons of the tradition. And I think what I find really fascinating, even the discussions around war and genocide more recently, is how we understand kind of collective subjection, right? So this idea that we have to be a part of this other group in order to identify with what they're experiencing, and not understanding that we're simultaneously experiencing that violence, even inflicting violence, we're simultaneously experiencing that violence. So I think that's really important. So I think part of also what I'm always trying to argue, it's not by virtue of me being a Black woman in an African diasporic space that automatically allows me to kind of identify with this group, is partly because how I'm experiencing the violence, but also how I'm understanding collectively that I am part of a process of social transformation that will deeply impact not just their lives, but my life as well. I can't tell you the amount of times in a space like Brazil where people have said, well, tell me you're American. And I'm like, and what exactly will that resolve? I'm still experiencing the violence at home, whether it be at home in Brazil, at home in the United States. Black Lives Matter here. Black Lives Matters here in the United States, in North America, but so does it matter in Europe. So does it matter in Brazil. And that we see this as part of a diasporic process of ending the violence in terms of how it impacts and transforms all of our lives. So in essence, I think Laurence makes a good point. And I think that's also some of the themes that came up in the book, that that we're researching others as much as we're researching ourselves, right? And I think in these moments is that there's social movements to transform the societies that we live in collectively, and understand that we're part of a global world. We're part of a global process of social transformation and making lives better for all of us here, there, and everywhere. So I think that's really important. I like this idea of facilitating conversations. I use a couple of examples in my own work of the moments where I chose to remain silent to the collective detriment of the group. And they said, well, I didn't want to interfere, you know, I'm not from here, etc. And in those moments, it was to our collective detriment, remaining silent, to understand there's something to be gained from my life experience, having grown up in Jamaica and living in the United States as an immigrant, that there's something for people on the ground in Brazil to gain, and that I can be part of a conversation without barriers and hierarchies, et cetera, to say, well, I'm an academic and I don't want to do this. But in essence, we're all part of a collective struggle for improving our lives, right? So I think seeing that we can speak to each other, as Laurence was saying, I think is really important, that I'm not speaking for, we're speaking with each other as part of a collective social movement. I think what I've learned in the process and taking students this semester is I'm beginning to kind of even train them to see, well, look, we're not going to Brazil to see just exactly how messed up Brazil is, but to see how we are kind of looking and we're part of a similar kind of conversation. So I get students in my Brazil classes oftentimes looking for paradise elsewhere. They're like, okay, well, the United States must be messed up, so certainly I can find it elsewhere. And what they find is, oh, well, wait a second, the petrochemical companies that dominate, that are built in the Bay, or Volkswagen and Ford that have been built in Black communities and are, poisoning Black communities in the Bay of All Saints. Also, you can see the similarities to what's going on in Mississippi around the petrochemicals there, and you can begin to be part of a global conversations about what it's like, what people are experiencing. So I think that's one of the lessons. So I think for me, what I found in terms of this idea around centering voices, I think what I've been struggling with my own, especially PhD students, is it's not about centering voices more than it is about listening. A deep, radical listening that is required to write about the very subject matters that people are telling you that they want to write about. And they want to be heard. They want to be part of a global conversation, right? I think having co-writing, and that's one of the chapters is about collaborative writing. And I know I saw Joanna Rappaport on the schedule, and in the book is, and we've co-authored an essay together. I think the thing is that there's the collaborative writing process always produces a different kind of knowledge than we can ever imagine, because it requires a kind of radical listening, a radical learning together to produce ideas together that otherwise you yourself would not necessarily prioritize those topics. So when I tell you that in the first interview, Donaida C., who herself dies in a police confrontation in terms of police violence, she says, you can't understand any of this. You want to write about housing, land, you can't understand any of this without looking at state violence. So immediately it's my lens of understanding the violent processes of urban redevelopment is tied to policing, primarily because she makes it an issue. And I say, okay, now I'm listening to what you're trying to tell me. I go to Brazil, enamored by Brazilian culture and African aesthetics, et cetera. And I get there and they say, no, that's not what we're really concerned about. We're really concerned about water, clean water, good quality housing, that we love being Black and beautiful, and that is and wearing Black and African and wearing African clothing, but that's not what is primarily occupying us. And I find that the challenge for researchers is that they're kind of honed in on what they think they want to do. They're not doing what people think is important in terms of understanding like what's shaping the political issues of the day. And I think that's what's the importance of looking at social movements, listening, learning with them, taking them seriously as classrooms. And I also write about the importance of, especially for those of us who spend years and years in terms of building relationships and rapport, that they become our collaborators, but also teachers, language teachers, political teachers. A lot of what I know now about even racial capitalism, urban redevelopment, all of this, the radical critiques about white supremacy is grounded and rooted, of course, in social movement conversations. So it's not a top-down, you're the scholar, I am, you're the activist. In essence, we're co-learners about how to transform the society. And I found that especially poignant when we all had to teach a class together to university students. And I think it also changed and reshaped how the students thought about activists as scholars, but also how they thought about themselves as scholars and activists on the student side, right? So I'll just kind of stop there.
Thanks a lot, Keisha-Khan, and wonderful questions and comments. Is a very small question for you. You're talking about Black radical tradition where, knowledge is knowledge for liberation. It's a collective, producing knowledge is a collective project for liberation. And that's how you understand social movement research, and how I understand social movement research as well, as producing knowledge that is useful, relevant for the struggles in different ways. Each struggle will define what is relevant and how can knowledge be useful in its own situation. But my question is, how do you survive in North American academia and it's the same here in European academia, where there's a narrow disciplinary canonical understanding of social movement research that is absolutely don't care at all about relevance, being engaged, producing counter-hegemonic knowledge that confronts the multiple violence that people, has to confront in their lives. So is there any dialogue between people that comes from Black radical tradition and this more narrow disciplinary understanding of social movement research? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. I'm barely surviving here. I don't know exactly how to frame this, but I'll say this, and it's tough because you're also kind of living a life. You're also trying to, I always tell people, people talk abstractly, Black Lives Matter, but you're also trying to make sure that you're healthy physically, mentally, your children are healthy, physically, mentally, your family members are also. So it's like Black Lives Matter extends into all facets of our lives. It's not just an abstract thought. You're trying to make sure that, your child, walks home safely from school, for example, right? So I think there's that. I think I'll go and say that it's not automatic that Africana studies or Black studies is now following suit in that tradition. I think that there's a lot of, even in Black studies, Africana studies, research of Black people, but not research in advance of a radical tradition or in advance of a liberatory struggle, right? So in terms of in terms of liberation, I don't think it's an automatic understanding that is the goal currently, or that is the primary vocation of scholars in Africana studies or Black studies departments. Who comes to mind, and I cited it briefly, was Vincent Hardin. His essay, The Vocation of the Black Scholar, is really important, and I oftentimes teach it in my Introduction to Black Studies courses, because I want to remind students about what the primary early aims of the field was in terms of doing this work. We go back to the Du Boises, we go back to the Fanons, we go to now what you have. So you have a division between people who are studying texts about liberation versus to the people who are trying to move that discourse into practice. And I think what you oftentimes have is you now have a disconnect as well, where people are studying Black people, but not preoccupied with Black liberation. So the conditions of Black people, but not necessarily a transformational process about how do you go from understanding the condition to transforming those conditions. So I think all of that is taking place, right? And I think there's the heavy focus on discourse and text is oftentimes very separate from ethnography, which I think is really important. So there's an abstract or kind of theoretical kind of framing now in Black studies that's taking place, an embracing of Sylvia Wynter, even though people don't always kind of go back and reread the work and how deeply entrenched it is in, for example, her critiques of state violence, et cetera. Frantz Fanon, of course, was writing about revolution because revolutionary struggles were taking place. So there's a disconnect between those theoretical practices and engaging Black lives and social transformation. So I think it's really important to make those distinctions and to understand that there's still an ideological and kind of political struggles going on in the academy, including in Black studies and feminist studies, right? Because even now there's a lot of, the automation of terms like intersectionality, but in terms of, and I talk extensively about how Black feminists, for example, were concerned not just with their understandings of themselves as feminists, but certainly deeply entrenched. For example, the Combahee River Collective was a deep class struggle and grounded in the transformation of marginalized communities, right? So I think they were preoccupied with struggles around public education, struggles around police abuse, housing. So partly what I'm saying is that the field itself needs to get back to those concrete struggles that informed the theoretical practices that we're so excited about today, right? So people want to engage feminist theory without engaging the feminist practices that are taking place in public housing movements, that are taking place in struggles against around education, police abuse, et cetera. So I think that's something to say. So the idea that, I don't know if I'm kind of quietly doing the work oftentimes without announcing it, seeing the teaching as a radical space of engagement. I still see the students, especially undergraduate students, as the eager, hungry folks who are kind of trying to learn about being better humans in the world. I still see the reason why the state in places like Brazil and here are attacking classrooms is because they understand the power of the classroom and what is viable, what is possible in terms of changing the minds of young people. And so I think there's an ideological war that we're fighting, in essence, on the ground in university classrooms. It's not by happenstance that, for example, in terms of the case around George Floyd, I won't use the current examples. We see we see how it's moving in the United States in recent weeks, in recent days and weeks. But the case of George Floyd, for example, there's a hidden story behind Minneapolis being the center of a movement against police abuse. So I did a review of the University of Minnesota's African and African American Studies Department, I believe maybe 5 years ago, or maybe I can't remember when it was. I'm losing track of time. I guess technically it can't be 5 years because COVID feels like it was 4 years ago. So I'm losing track of time. But I did a review of the University of Minnesota's Black Studies Department. What I noted was that they had fought at the University of Minnesota. They had an ethnic studies requirement that included Latinx, African American studies, and indigenous studies. They fought as a group of professors, worked with teachers in the city of Minneapolis to make ethnic studies a requirement for graduation from high school. What it meant is every student graduating from the city of Minneapolis had to take ethnic studies. It had to take African American studies, indigenous studies, et cetera, right? And so you had a young population prepared to face what we saw then in the terms of the movements around police abuse. So I think you can see a direct line between ethnic studies at University of Minnesota, indigenous studies at the University of Minnesota, Latinx studies, African American studies, public education, and a group of young people who took to the streets in defense of the humanity of George Floyd and Black and brown people in general. So I think those are the connections that I think we need to be making. Ibram Kendi, a lot of people criticize his recent work, but some of his early work around Black studies actually is making the argument that we need to go back to those foundational ideas that involve service learning, that involve community-based work in terms of education. And a lot of the undergraduate students now are saying, no, we want to do this theoretical work. We want to do these textual analyses, but we want to understand how we're going to be able to apply it in our education. So a lot of students are now demanding more service learning education, not just out of Black studies, but generally speaking. But it's not by happenstance that you see students taking over universities today, but also there's a high school population that are coming in already prepared because they've had that experience in the classroom. And that is also why across the United States, you have very conservative state governments who are banning books as well as banning the teaching of these ideas because they're absolutely fearful that the population is going to rise up, which is exactly what an educated population does, which is they have a tremendous amount of knowledge of what kind of rights they have, what kind of society they want to build beyond the one that we currently know. Right. So I would say, I don't know if I'm surviving, but I feel like I'm in a struggle around teaching radical education and preparing the next generation of young people who are completely open to learning and transforming the society that we live in. Thank you so much, Alberto, for that comment and question. But there's so much more I could talk about it. But I'm really hopeful of young people in the undergraduate classroom. But I do, just on a side note as well, I want to say that more radical students and scholars are absolutely being pushed out of universities.
That's certainly true. And it seems that I'm forced to assume this role of a facilitator somehow. Right. Well, do we want to open it up for a broader discussion? So if there are any questions or comments from anyone on this call, please either raise your hand or put your question in the chat. and let's open this conversation and discussion up to everyone out there. So if you have comments, questions, please feel free to voice them. No, I don't see any questions so far. So maybe there is a question from Nandini Oza. And the question is, how is oral history of those who are part of social movements considered by researchers of social movements, by academia? Is there anyone who'd like to take that one?
Yeah. So I'm going to say it varies. There are a lot of good historians and a lot of good social movement scholars who pay an awful lot of attention to oral history. And then there are some who don't. And that does tell you something about who you're dealing with. So definitely in the right time, the right place, people do pay attention. No, we can take questions, just raise a hand or unmute and ask. What I want to say, though, as well, is that oral history is very often one of the easiest ways that movements do their own research. It's one of the things in a number of cultures, at least, that's most accessible because people are doing it anyway. And it's quite not a big leap to go, well, let's do this a bit more systematically. Maybe let's publish it or whatever. So when you say oral history, you're also often saying movement's own research, and it's important to actually support that as well as sometimes go, maybe the movement doesn't have the capacity to do it, but let's help. And there, I think we've got a question from Judith or Judith.
Hi, yes, thank you. I'm joining you from Spain as well. Hi, Alberto. And I've switched sides a little bit. I've been an activist, or I still consider myself an activist first and foremost. And now I study movements and trying to get into this, the tradition or a little bit the scholarship, the methods of social movement research. So super grateful for the book and these sessions. And coming from this movement perspective, I find myself a little bit torn between, on the one side, a little bit, when we come very close to the movement in our research, we maybe also tend to subjectify their analysis, the problems that they see. When we do an ethnography, then this is the perspective of the movement, and therefore maybe not an analysis that is to be taken seriously in a broader context. I see this tendency a little bit to other the movement as something, very particular side phenomenon of society, which is maybe, which doesn't help the cause maybe in some ways. And on the other hand, I find also big value in trying to bring the objective context in and bring it together. So maybe the material analysis, the systems of oppression, not only articulated as a perspective of the movement, but solid social science. So I'm trying to find my proximity to the movement as I go forward now. And some of you have already touched on this, Laurence and Keisha. Thank you very much. But I still wanted to raise a question, particularly on how do you differentiate coming from your own role, your own perspective on the movement, not to make it too much a subjective perspective or marginal perspective, but also, trying to bring the context, also understanding that this objective researcher role brings its own problems and complications and has been criticized a lot. Thanks. I hope this was clear.
Should we take one more question and then open it up again? I see there's another person who has raised their hand. Pierre, if I pronounce that right. Go ahead. See. Oh, there you go. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, the entire team, for your entire talk. I just want to know and understand. We have been talking about the social movements and the problems of the world and many sort of research programs. And I've been seeing a lot of social and subjective and fragmented realities for the last few decades, and the identity politics and limitations of the expression, sufferings and absurdities and human conditioning. So I'm wondering to know, in the perspective of philosophy and the absurd literature that can contribute to these movements, because the philosophy, I personally understand that to deconstruct the social truths and those subjective truths who have been made by the suppressive type of nations or narratives that have been constructed by these big minds, so-called big minds, I would say. So I'm wondering to know, how can philosophy contribute to deconstruct and expose these hegemonic narratives? And can we use philosophy to contribute to these type of social movements through research? Thank you.
Okay, and we have one more question in the chat, which maybe connects. So Josh asking about researching movements in other disciplines and saying that within, I guess, his discipline of landscape architecture, you need to start by arguing why people should look at movements at all. So there's maybe a crossover there.
And we should also say that all of these questions are open not only to the people on the panel here, but to anyone on this call. So if anyone feels like they have a good answer or something that they would like to share, please feel free to answer any of these questions.
Well, let me say something just about Josh's question, because I know something about this. And it's a bit like the answer to the question on critical oral history. Academics are deeply, deeply provincial and ethnocentric. If you walk into a particular department doing a particular discipline in a particular country, very often they will all turn to you and say, we don't do that. Or we do this, but we only do it this way. As though this is true across the world, when very often it's not even true in the next institution down the road with this department with the same name on it. Some places are more homogenous than others, but social movement studies in many, many countries exists in the cracks, like Leonard Cohen said. So sometimes sociologists do it, sometimes political scientists do it. Then geographers came in and kind of took over a whole swathe of territory. And then you find a bunch of people who in another generation might have been sociologists, and now they're critical management consultants and they're doing it, or historians or whatever. So what it means to you if you're trying to do it is trying to find those allies. Trying to find the people within your discipline, within your country, near at hand, who will somehow say, well, actually, yeah, this stuff is relevant. And to use the word interdisciplinary as often as you possibly can, because it is a very interdisciplinary field. But you find allies who say, yep, this stuff is real, it's relevant for our discipline. And of course, you look for, this is the main reason why we've done a book like this, is it gives people a bit of ammunition that they can go to a supervisor with or whatever and say, see, this is a thing. And maybe if they're lucky, the supervisor goes, yeah, okay, sounds like a thing, off you go. If they don't, you might need to find another supervisor. But you take that activist attitude to your role within the academy, and it will make you a much better researcher, as well as actually, be more useful to the movements. Not to go, tell me, dear teacher, what should I do? Am I allowed to do this? Go, I want to do this. How?
Can I just add to Lawrence's comment as well? I teach a class called Africana Studies and Interdisciplinarity. And what I've found is, kind of going back to some of the literature, I'm always fascinated by even how multidisciplinary a lot of the scholars that we celebrate today really were. I mean, you have Du Bois, everyone claims him, psychology, sociology, anthropology, as well as history, all of them, right? I think what's really fascinating is we have to start to ask ourselves, what is our investment in being disciplined? What I've found in teaching these classes is that what they started with were questions that they then tried to find the methods to understand those questions. So, for example, what does it feel like to be a problem in the society? Is one of the questions that Du Bois asked. And then he has to go through the various mechanisms, explore various methods to try to find ways, historical methods, sociological methods, to find ways to answer those questions. I think we really have to think about what is our investment in being disciplined within the academy that also then limits what kinds of answers we can find. For example, a lot of creative mechanisms of understanding liberation in the Black tradition comes out of literature. It comes out of being creative. It comes out of poetry. It comes out of fiction. It comes out of the imagination of what is not yet exists, right? So I think that is what is kind of really fascinating to me. We've become, and I think there was a previous question about kind of objectivity. We've become so obsessed with facts rather than the creative imagination. And what does it mean to imagine this kind of new world? I'm always fascinated, even now, with all of, even just you look at an example of kind of how people are managing kind of gender and even the use of gender in language. And I'm like, people are sitting around literally just using their imagination about how we can push and stretch the language itself, right? And that is, so I think that our obsession with that, it has to be a particular way, a particular kind of truth and fact that has already been constructed by someone else, that I think it's kind of limits what kind of world we can kind of build anew. So I think we have to think about how we're also slightly obsessed with kind of, what's the word I'm thinking in Portuguese, of kind of belonging to a particular discipline. You have historians who are like, they're not historical enough. I literally had to think about what discipline I wanted to enter in the academy. I had in a conversation with my advisor, we talked about political science, and I'm like, I don't know if I'll be able to do the too disciplined. History, too disciplined. And anthropology, in essence, became the way, and I was coming out of literature as an undergraduate. I did Latin American literature and Spanish and linguistics. Linguistics was too scientific, in essence. They were going in a very scientific direction. And I was like, well, anthropology, I feel like I could bend it enough to do everything that I wanted to do. So I think, and I think today anthropology is fighting amongst itself, trying to be more disciplined and discipline itself. That they're losing a lot of the best students, because students are saying, well, I guess now I'll just go to the interdisciplinary fields like gender and sexuality studies or Africana studies, ethnic studies, et cetera, American studies, whatever kind of those general kind of more interdisciplinary fields. So I think we have to think carefully about how we ourselves are kind of participating and kind of solidifying this power struggle within the academy, rather than being preoccupied with the kinds of questions that we need to ask and where we need to find them. And we may not always find them with the restrictive kind of the rigid confines of our discipline. We might need to go read some poetry. We might need to go explore some literature. We might need to go look at some of the sociological texts. We might need to read across the disciplines in order to get those answers.
Yeah, and that's just to add to that, that's exactly how research within social movements have always has always been done, right? I mean, like when you've got movement researchers within the movements and you happen to go to a social center and look at their bookshelves, right? You find all sorts of books in all sorts of different disciplines. And there is no like a discipline police within a social movement that limits you to any particular viewpoint or approach. So I guess, there is a lot of freedom in terms of how some of our research can be framed and can be approached. And it is, at the end of the day, it is about imagining alternatives as much as learning about things that are out there already, right? I mean, like these things are important because they provide a base, they open up certain ways of thinking, but I think that another sort of outcome of or an effect or a consequence of us sort of shutting down into our own disciplines is that we're also kind of limiting our imaginations to a large degree. So this is just like as a short comment on what's been said. All right. Do we have any other questions or answers or comments? Question, we do. If there's time for Keisha-Khan along with the panel as a whole. Oh, sorry, that moved. That question moved.
I saw Antonia's question, and I realized I had missed part of Josh's question as well.
Go ahead.
Is there time for that, or to respond, or to?
Yes, please do so.
Okay, thank you. I really struggled with that, which is why I'm writing this separate book about kind of researching ourselves as much as researching others. I mean, I came out of a racial condition in the United States that, in essence, I was hopeful that would be different elsewhere, only to discover that the social dynamics were they were very similar, even with their particularities. So I think that's what I'm responding to in terms of realizing that a lot of that we're really need to think more diasporically, more globally about how we're experiencing social problems and the solutions to them. I think that's part of the reason why we struggle so much with even understanding war and violence and genocide, et cetera, until the terror comes, for example, to the United States, that we can't quite grapple with it unless it's in our front door. But I think there's a certain kind of expansion of our kind of definition of human that Sylvia Wynter and others have theorized that we really need to think more seriously about, because I think there's another scholar who wrote about kind of the half-connected human, and I can't find that article easily, but I think oftentimes we're really working from a premise of half-connected humanity, that we see ourselves as kind of, we can't quite fully connect with the people that we're working with and see ourselves as quite distinct or different. So we kind of have a different level of engagement and investment in the work that they're doing. So I would say I think it's tough. In the first book, I think not because of critique, but I was really I didn't really want the story to be about me doing the work. I wanted it to be about these women who had been doing the work for generations. And what's really more important is that I am based in the United States, family-wise and professionally, that the work continues while I'm not there. And of course, my contributions are quite distinct when I'm also not living in Brazil anymore. So I think that was part of my first project, is to tell a story about a social movement taking place without it being a story about myself. This book is about what is possible for people who are researchers working across borders, about what is viable, what kind of work is possible, what kind of questions emerge, what kind of challenges they face, and that we're, in essence, fighting a similar kind of struggle across borders. So I think that's how I chose to write the book. I'm not sure that is how everyone should do it. I also have to acknowledge that I spent much of my adult years, I would say my 20s, in these places. I'm also growing as a person, but also growing as a thinker. I'm living, discovering myself. I'm, figuring out who I am as a person in the world. So in essence, I can't even think about who I am, even if, in terms of biographically, without thinking about the years I spent working alongside folks, right? So in essence, to not acknowledge that would be to erase a significant part of my own kind of life story. I learned Portuguese with these folks. I mean, I learned how to write in Portuguese. I learned how to present at conferences. I learned how to speak in public. I learned all of these things. I learned how to take notes and those kind of things by participating during that period of my life. So it has in essence become part of my life story as well. Just a question about why to make the argument about why we need to listen to social movements. I think what I found most fascinating is that the people who are living most on the margins, in this case in Brazil, Black women, poor, coming out of communities that are fighting displacement, is that they're the ones that are really, they have a much keener understanding of how the society operates. So, for example, Bell Hooks talks a lot about her book, I forgot the name of the title of the book, but it's something about from her argument about from the margins is that the people on the margin can oftentimes see the center and the people in the center don't oftentimes look out at the margins. So the people on the margins know the margin and also know the center. And you see that in academia as well, where you have marginalized, scholars who have to read, in essence, the scholar that has become canonical as well as the non-canonical text in order to understand the world more broadly. So I would say you'd be amazed at how different, for example, an urban planner's work could do if they spoke to the people whose lives they were planning, about what kinds of needs they have, the kind of unique kind of frames for understanding architecture, et cetera. And I think there's some really good critical architecture work that's coming out of places like the American University in Beirut and other places. I'm not familiar with all of these departments, but certainly I think it would look very different if engineers, planners, et cetera, really paid more attention to the needs of the people that they're planning for, instead of it being kind of kind of you're planning people's lives without their involvement. So I would just stop there. I don't know if there's any other question, but I'll just stop there. Thank you so much for these questions.
Thank you very much. And it seems that we're just in time to finish this session. Thank you so much for your participation. And it was lovely to hear from you, Keisha, and I hope there will be many more discussions coming out of this exchange.
And thank you so much for the book and involving me in this conversation.
Thanks very much. All right, so this has been session 3. We still have a couple of more sessions coming up. The next one is going to start in half an hour, and it's going to be session 4, classical and contemporary modes of analysis. So we're not going to stop the stream, so you can just, pause for half an hour and come back. And there are other sessions running until, well, for me, for European time, until late at night, but depending on your time zone, that's going to work out differently. So thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully you stay on to see some of the other sessions. If not, it was lovely to see you, and we hope to stay in touch and to continue these discussions. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna.
Thank you.